Now the next topic is how to establish defaults, or how to establish default parameters for machining operations, and we're going to focus on that. Now I currently have a part that's open and I have a bunch of machining operations programmed in here. Now in this particular operation you'll notice that I have a certain set of parameters set for my cutting parameters. So for example, I have for hole profiling I have selected create full 360-degree helixes only and output each helix individually. I also have selected the helix pitch and also the entry and exit parameters, and I also established sorting parameters. Now I would like to use the same operation parameters, same cut parameters on other files. However, I'm not going to be using a knowledge base to load them, but I would like to program them from the menu of operations under machining operations. So to save the time to having to go through the process of re-entering each of these information, you can save the parameter settings to a default. So you select the operation that you programmed, right-click on the operation, and then you click on Save as Defaults. Now, when you click on Save as Defaults, you'll be prompted to save this under the Defaults folder, depending on whether you're working with RhinoCam or VisualCam or VisualCam for SOLIDWORKS. You would save this under Defaults. I'm going to call this Default. And you can have multiple default knowledge bases. You could group them based on the material type you're working with. So I could call this default for wood. You can have a default for cutting steel, aluminum based on material, or you could even have a default based on your machine tool. You might be working with one or more machine tools, and you can have defaults saved for each machine tool. So here I'm going to call this default for wood, and I'm going to hit Save. Now I get a prompt saying it's successfully saved. Now if I go into 2-axis from the menu and choose hole profiling, and as I go to the cut parameters, you will notice that the parameters in here are being loaded from the defaults. Now they're not being loaded from the factory default settings that were there. They're being loaded from the defaults. Now so we can specify defaults for each and every operation type that are available. So you can have a defaults for each and every operation type for 2-axis, 3-axis. They can all be in the same knowledge base. So now I can select the engraving operation, right-click, and pick Save as Defaults. Now all of the parameters in the engraving operations are being saved to the same default knowledge base. I could do the same thing for the profiling operation as well. Right-click and then select Save as Defaults. So the next time you create a profile operation, the parameters for the profile operation are being loaded from the defaults. As you can see, I have use outside or inside and inside selected. So these settings are being loaded from the default knowledge base. Even the depth parameters are being loaded from the default knowledge bases as well. Now, to create multiple defaults, you can change this by going over to your CAM preferences, and as you go to machining, you will notice that the default knowledge base to load is set to the knowledge base that you just defined to be your default. Now we can change this to undefined. So setting it to undefined will switch it back to the factory default settings. Now if I go back to the hole profiling operation, you will notice that this is back to the factory default settings in here. And now if you'd like to create a new default knowledge base with a different set of parameters, you can key in these parameters in here. So for example, I could say I want to do a climb cutting and set the pitch to be 50 thousandths in here. And I'm going to save, right-click on the operation, and pick Save as Default. And I can give it a different name in here. I can call this default for a different material type. I'm going to call it aluminum. I'm just going to call the AL for aluminum, and I hit Save. I now have a default knowledge base for machining parts for aluminum. I have a default knowledge base for machining parts for wood, and you can set which default knowledge base to use before you start programming by going into CAM Preferences Machining, and you can pick the default knowledge base to use by selecting it from the list right in here. So you can save all the default parameter settings for each operation type into your default knowledge base.